It was a mainstay of English law after 1660 until directly contradicted by the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, Lord Goddard, in 1954, that to try a person for murder required the presence of a body. Without a body, there could be no proof that the person was dead, still less that they'd been murdered. When Maimie Stuart disappeared in the winter of 1919 and 1920, the absence of a corpse presented police with a difficulty. Until it was located, she was simply a missing person. There was persuasive evidence that she was dead and strong circumstantial evidence pointing to the identity of her killer. But in spite of extensive searches, police were unable to find a body, and without one, there could be no inquest, let alone a trial for murder. The case of Maimie Stuart provides a fascinating disquisition into English law and into the frailty of human nature.
In January 1920, Maimie Stuart's family in Sunderland were concerned. She had written to them on the 12th of November, but in spite of being a punctilious correspondent with her family, they had not heard from her since. Perhaps she was busy in the Christmas season, and they were relieved to receive a telegram on the 24th of December from her home in Swansea wishing them a happy Christmas. They had written to her in the new year, but their letters were returned bearing the legend, "House Closed." This seemed odd because Maimie had only provided them with the new address quite recently. They knew from letters she had previously sent to them that her marriage to her husband George was troubled. Indeed, she had expressed the intention of leaving him on more than one occasion, so it seemed possible that she may have left him. Their anxiety increased, however, when Maimie failed to contact them, and her sister Edith wrote to her previous landlady, Mrs. Hearn, at 28 Trafalgar Terrace in Swansea, asking if she had heard from Maimie. Mrs. Hearn had not. Then, in March 1920, Swansea police received a routine call from the Grosvenor Hotel in College Street, Swansea, indicating that a portmanteau bag had been left at the hotel in December and had not subsequently been claimed. Upon opening the portmanteau, police found it contained shredded women's clothes, a pair of shoes, and a piece of paper with a Sunderland address written on it. The address was that of James and Jane Stuart, and on contacting them, police discovered that their daughter Maimie had been missing for 3 months, and that the clothes and shoes belonged to her. An inquiry was launched to find Maimie, and given the circumstances of her disappearance and the contents of the letters she had sent and received, the police became anxious to locate her husband, George Shotton. They found George, but to their astonishment they discovered he was living with his wife and son at a nearby house in Caswell Bay. When interviewed, George denied having bigamously married Maimie, but admitted to knowing her for a time and living with her. But he said they had argued and she had left him, upon which he had left the portmanteau with her possessions in it at a hotel and returned to his wife and son. Maimie Stuart was born Amy Stuart on the 24th of November 1893 to James Stuart, a master mariner, and his wife Jane. She was a pretty, bright and vivacious girl with brown hair and blue-grey eyes. At the age of just 15, she left home to go on stage as a dancer and was a member of a number of touring dance troupes, appearing in pantomime throughout the provinces in the years leading up to and during the First World War. Maimie appears to have been a headstrong, flirtatious girl, always fashionably attired. She liked being the centre of attention, and she had a number of lovers during this period of her life. It was on a visit home to Sunderland in July 1917 that she met George Shotton. He was surveying a Norwegian ship, the Margot, there, when he encountered Maimie walking with a friend near the docks, and what he later termed misconduct occurred between them. She was 23 years old, and he was a 37-year-old well-to-do marine surveyor from Cardiff, with offices in Mount Stuart Square in Cardiff's thriving maritime quarter. He was a personable and charming man who took care of his appearance and was described by those who knew him as a dandy. In spite of the fact that he was married, he possessed a keen interest in attractive women. Besides the affinity of mutual attraction, George had something else in common with Maimie, as he too hailed from the Sunderland area, his father having moved to South Wales with his family some years before. George had met May Leader, whose father owned the Six Bells Inn in Newport St. Wooler's area, and they were married on the 7th of September 1905, afterwards settling in Penarth, a pleasant suburb of Cardiff, from which George could easily commute to his offices in the nearby Bay area. They were quite affluent. George's business thrived and took him to many ports around Britain, which often necessitated him staying away from home. Then, in 1917, he met Maimie Stuart. What had doubtless begun in Sunderland as a dalliance, of which George probably had many, soon became something more. There is no doubt that George became smitten with Maimie, and this was, for a time at least, fully reciprocated by her. Of course he was married, and in spite of his claims that Maimie had always known this, it is quite clear that she had no idea at all. They married on March the 25th, 1918, in the registry office in South Shields, spent a few days in London, and from this time on lived in a number of places, often in hotels in Liverpool, Bristol, and other places George travelled to with his work. His life was complicated. He was often absent from Maimie due to the requirements of his work, and it is apparent that he was attempting to divide his time between his two households. In February 1919, George and Maimie moved to a lodging with a Mrs. Hearn at 28 Trafalgar Terrace, Swansea. Soon after this, George moved his wife from Penarth to a house called Graigueithen in Langland, approximately 3 miles from Swansea. Here he would spend 3 or 4 days each week, whilst being required by work to be elsewhere on the other days. There must have been a great deal of stress on George Shotton during this period of double deception. He had 2 wives, maintained 2 homes, and had a son who was then 3 years old. As time passed, there was another source of stress for him. Maimie was a young woman of a flighty disposition. She enjoyed the attention of men. In those frequent and necessary absences of his, she sought diversions. She went out with her landlady and friend, Mrs. Hearn. It seems to have rankled with Mrs. Hearn, because she said later that she had on more than one occasion told Maimie she would not go out with her because she attracted so many men. It was only a matter of time before such behaviour would inevitably lead to trouble. They were dalliances, and what George knew of these is unclear, but he certainly had suspicions and knowledge of at least one letter she had received from a Canadian officer. The relationship between Maimie and George inevitably deteriorated. It became strained, quarrelsome, marked by jealousy, and occasionally violent. He accused her of encouraging the attentions of officers. The strain on Shotton was considerable. He had no intention of leaving his wife and son, and seems to have been unable to relinquish Maimie either. For her part, Maimie seems to have been puzzled by Shotton's behaviour. He was by turns hot and cold with her, often acted bizarrely. He wanted her and he didn't. He was sometimes intense, at other times distant. She wrote to her parents describing him as odd. Of course, his behaviour was one of a man caught in an impossible situation. A situation which could not go on forever. Maimie wrote to her parents in the early summer of 1919, saying she was going to leave him. She said he had hit her across the head, left her with bruised arms, On one occasion he had accused her of stealing £22 from him and threatened to call the police. She also wrote to her sister Edith, expressing her fears of her husband and begging her family to inquire of Mrs. Hearn if she should disappear. In July of 1919 they split up. George left Trafalgar Terrace on the 19th of July, and she returned to Sunderland on the 22nd of July. But he wrote to her soon after, and they maintained a correspondence throughout the summer. He visited her in Sunderland in September 1919. They were reconciled, and he returned to Swansea to find them new accommodation. He took a residence called Bonavista, or Llanwith, in Caswell Bay, near to the family home he had recently taken in Langland. Perhaps he felt that keeping the two homes close together would ease the burden of his commuting between them. Of course, he was still caught in a double deception of being apparently married to two women. Maimie returned to Swansea to join him at their new home on the 5th of November 1919. It was the last time she was seen. The investigation into the disappearance of Maimie Stuart was a complex one. Maimie and George, separately and together, had been associated with many parts of Britain, and Swansea police found it difficult to conduct and coordinate these inquiries. In June, they called on the assistance of Scotland Yard for this, and Detective Chief Inspector William Draper was dispatched to take charge of the inquiries. He spoke to her friends and acquaintances, to Mrs. Hearn, to Shotton and his associates, and an extensive search was launched to find Maimie. A description of her was issued and widely circulated in the press, even in Canada, where Draper believed she might have travelled with a Canadian officer, a paymaster in the army, with whom she had been involved. This latter business muddied the waters somewhat with press and public alike. It led to equivocation in the matter of whether Maimie was alive or not. It was believed that she had been involved with a farmer in the area too, and one letter was addressed to "My dearest Dulbert." Draper established that Maimie had travelled to Swansea on the 5th of November 1919 with the intention of meeting Shotton. She was known to have arrived in Swansea because her ticket had been processed by the Great Western Railway Company. However, appeals for information concerning a man driving her from Swansea Station on the evening of the 5th of November also produced nothing of significance. George Shotton drove a yellow car, and it was hoped that this might have been noticed, but it wasn't. Although Maimie had sent a letter home on the 12th of November, apparently from the house at Newton in Caswell, no one had seen her there. It could not be positively proven by any eyewitness that she had been at the house, although it seemed fairly certain that she had been. Mrs. Hearn had neither seen nor heard from her, but there was no evidence that she had ever left Swansea after the 12th of November either. Maimie was an avid letter writer, and her family became convinced that she was dead. They did not believe that she would not contact them if she was able to do so. Given the state of the relationship between husband and wife, Maimie's determination to leave Shotton, and the fact that Shotton was the last person known, by his own statement, to have seen Maimie, that she feared him, intended to leave him, and that George Shotton had married her bigamously, it was becoming increasingly clear that Maimie was dead, and that the chief suspect in causing her death was her husband, George Shotton. For his part, George Shotton said he had last seen her on the 5th or 6th of December in Oxford Street in Swansea. The two had argued, and it was the last time he had seen or heard of her. This presented police with a problem. The evidence pointed towards Maimie being dead, and to George Shotton being responsible for her death. But without a body, it was considered impossible to charge Shotton. English law in this matter was established by the Camden Wonder case in 1660, in which a local man, Will Harrison, disappeared, and following an investigation, it was determined that a woman and her 2 sons had murdered him. They were tried and hanged, and 2 years later, William Harrison turned up alive and well. From this time on, the principle was established that if a body could not be found, there could be no certainty that the person was dead, still less that they had been murdered. This precedent, with rare exceptions, held fast in English law up until the 1950s. In 1919 there was little prospect of such a precedent being overturned. Provided that no body was found, the first stages in the legal process of bringing a murder charge to bear could not be progressed. Even with a body, the evidence would be entirely circumstantial. Maimie intended to visit George Shotton. She had travelled to see him. It seemed certain that she was at the house in Caswell Bay, but it could not be proved that she was there after the 12th of November, and it could not be disproved that Shotton had not seen her for the last time on the 5th or 6th of December. He admitted to leaving the portmanteau at the hotel, but said he had left it there because he had found it after she had left him. He admitted to living with Maimie, but not to marrying her. There really was little beyond a reasonable suspicion that George Shotton had murdered Maimie Stuart sometime in November or December of 1919. All searches in the Caswell Bay area and of the garden and house Bonavista coming to nothing, the police could not begin to construct a case for submission to the Crown prosecution. The only evidence on which they could proceed against him was that of bigamy. On the 21st of May 1920, George Shotton was arrested as he arrived at Swansea Station by Detective Sergeant Arthur Aynon and Inspector Fox of Swansea Police. The trial began on the 27th of July 1920 before Justice Avery at Swansea Assizes. The prosecution case was that George Shotton had bigamously married Maimie Stuart on the 25th of March 1918, and that there was proof that he was already married at the time to May Leader, who he had married in 1905. The defence countered that George Shotton had lived with Maimie Stuart, but that she had always known him to be married, that she had gone through a marriage ceremony on the 25th of March 1918 with a man impersonating him as George Shotton, probably to allay her parents' concerns. They produced letters from Maimie which, they said, demonstrated that she was capable of deceiving her parents. Sir Edward Marley Sampson, for the defence, said Maimie was thoroughly immoral and worthless in regard to her relations with men. But Sir Ellis Griffith, for the Crown, said the prisoner's story was improbable and incredible. There was a wealth of evidence against George. 1. The marriage certificate to his first, his only, wife was proved in court by the appearance of the registrar at St. Wooler's in Newport, the production of the marriage certificate, and then a witness in the form of his brother-in-law to confirm the matter. 2. The second marriage certificate was subjected to handwriting examination, which suggested he had tried to disguise his handwriting, but that it was undoubtedly his. 3. Although witnesses at the marriage in the registry office in South Shields had been 2 clerks in the office, neither of whom were able to confirm the matter of identity of the groom, various witnesses were called to prove that George Shotton was in South Shields on the 25th of March, that he and Maimie Stuart had spent the night of their wedding at the Golden Lion Hotel in South Shields, and that numerous letters read in court alluded to Maimie as "my darling wife," "my sweet little wife," and ended, "your loving husband George." He had also introduced himself to her friends and family and other witnesses as her husband, and she had shown every indication in her conduct and all transactions that she believed herself to be Mrs. Maimie Shotton. In spite of all this, George seemed to believe he would succeed in persuading the jury that he had not married Maimie, and it was reported that he was nonchalantly reading a newspaper on the public benches during an interval in proceedings. But his confidence was misplaced. The jury took little more than 5 minutes to find him guilty. The judge admonished him and indicated that his wicked perjury in court had earned him a more severe sentence than he would otherwise have received, that of 18 months' imprisonment with hard labour at Swansea Prison. The case of Maimie Stuart thus came to an end, an unsatisfying end for most. The search for her body was ended, and detectives redeployed on other investigations. But the dead do not always lie easily. In the following years there were sightings of Maimie in India, South Africa, Australia, and many other places. Some of these sightings led to the case being re-examined and efforts made to establish whether or not these sightings were genuine, but none of them amounted to anything. They returned her and her case momentarily to the public's attention, resulting in a brief resume of the case being given and the circumstances of her disappearance, but little more. Workmen digging in the garden of Bonavista years after her disappearance led to the discovery of a woman's shoe. But the police declined to reopen the investigation because, they said, even if the shoe could be linked to Maimie, there was little it could add to the matter of her disappearance. Articles written in the 1940s and 1950s on the Maimie Stuart case focused on the mystery of whatever happened to Maimie Stuart. There was a consensus in these that she had died, but it seemed to be a mystery that would never be resolved. But that was wrong. One autumn day, 42 years later, on Sunday the 5th of November 1961, 3 friends, John Gurke, Colin Lloyd MacNamara, and Graham Jones, went potholing in Caswell Bay. The area is a rich repository of caves and old disused lead mine shafts, which offer many opportunities for potholers to explore. It was down a narrow air shaft of such a lead mine in Brandy Cove, Caswell Bay, that the 3 young men lowered themselves that morning. Some 50 feet down they discovered what appeared to be a tunnel, which had been blocked off by stones and rubble. Hoping to find the main tunnel to the mine, they removed the rubble and found a large flat rock the size of a paving stone, which appeared to have been deliberately placed across the entrance to the tunnel on its edge. They removed the stone and found further rubble and soil, under which there was a skull and some bones. The 3 men took the skull to the local police. Police returned to the site of the shaft, and using ropes and the slimmest of their officers, they were able to inspect the site, to remove samples of soil, the remaining bones and fragments of cloth and sacking. A swatch of brown hair attached to a 1920s-style hair comb and 2 rings were amongst the other finds at the site. Forensic tests quickly revealed that the bones belonged to a woman approximately 5'3" or 5'4" inches in height, that they had been sawn through in several places before being deposited in the mine shaft, and that the bones had lain in the shaft for some 40 years. Maimie Stuart had disappeared 42 years ago that month. The file on her disappearance was now reopened. While detailed forensic tests were carried out on the skeleton, which was almost complete, police began to try to trace the relatives and friends of Maimie Stuart. Most of her contemporary relatives were dead. Her father had died soon after the trial in 1921, and her mother in 1945. But a woman whom she had known in Bristol, and who had admired her engagement ring, was found. The jawbone had even-set teeth, with a single peculiarity. One upper tooth, next to the eye tooth on the right-hand side, was missing. The search for Maimie Stuart was over. For the first time, and after 42 years, this was now a murder inquiry. The search for George Shotton began. The investigation was led by Detective Inspector Graham Williams of Glamorgan CID. As there were no organs remaining on which to conduct a post-mortem, the coroner had to apply to the Home Secretary to conduct an inquest due to the unusual circumstances. The Home Secretary granted permission for this, confirming that, as there was other evidence to confirm identity, an inquest was justified. An inquest was duly appointed to be held at Gowerton in West Wales under the Gower coroner, Mr. D.R. James. 21 witnesses were called to give evidence, and a jury of 7 men were appointed to consider the matter. The press, meanwhile, had dusted off their old coverage of the matter, and there was great renewed interest in the disappearance of Maimie and in the whereabouts of George Shotton. He was thought to have left the country by some, and a woman, a Mrs. Ince of Newport, who was a close friend of the first Mrs. Shotton, May, said that she knew that he had died 10 years ago. The police promptly discounted this. Hopes of finding George were still high. Then, on the 30th of November 1961, it was announced to a chorus of disappointment that George Shotton had died 3 years earlier, in 1958. The inquest was opened in December 1961. The bones and skull lay on the table before the coroner and jury. The coroner spoke to the circumstances of the inquiry and to the procedural formalities relating to identification, and called witnesses. An account of the discovery of the bones was given by the 3 men who had found them. A detective constable, Ken Noakes, described that he had enlarged an old photograph of Maimie Stuart and matched it to the skull in terms of its features and the evenness of teeth, and noted the same single missing tooth in the upper right jaw. He said that it made it likely that the skull was that of Maimie Stuart, and the Home Office pathologist, Dr. W. R. Lester James, confirmed that this was his opinion also. The engagement ring was identified by Mrs. Elsie May Evans, who had known Maimie at Bristol in 1918, as being that which Maimie had shown her. All the other features of the skull and the circumstances accorded with the belief that the skeleton was that of Maimie Stuart. However, the pathologist, Dr. James, said there was no bullet, knife, or other damage to the skeleton to enable the cause of death to be determined. Her identity settled, the court heard evidence of the letters she had written to her family and had received from George Shotton, which alluded to her fear of him, her determination to leave him, and to the quarrelsome nature of their relationship. These were read out by Inspector Williams. One letter from George, written to Maimie at Sunderland during the months of their separation between July the 22nd and November the 5th, 1919, read, "You ask to be free. Are you not more free than any other girl? You wander to and fro at your own sweet will, with no one to question you or prohibit you. I do not quite understand in what matter I can do more. I have no intention of doing such awful things as you suggest. I can only imagine you mean me to go on a wrong path, so that you can divorce me." Although the letter to which he responds is unseen, the reply suggests that Maimie was seeking a divorce, and that she had accused him of threatening her with harm in some way. In another letter to her mother, written in early 1919, she wrote, "He has been ill-using me in Liverpool, and I will be leaving him. The man is not all there." The court was told that George Shotton was now dead, had been jailed for bigamy in 1920, but that the absence of Maimie's body had been an obstacle to pursuing a murder inquiry. There was one startling piece of evidence given at the inquest which deserves mention. An 83-year-old retired postman, William Simons, who had been the Caswell Bay postman in 1919, gave evidence that he was the last person to see Maimie alive, and that he had come across Shotton in December 1919, putting a heavy sack into his car, and offered to help him. "No, no, no! Oh, God," said George, "I thought you were the police." He then apparently drove off in the direction of Brandy Cove. This story seems to be improbable in the extreme. William Simons claimed that he had not told the police of this at the time because he had not thought it relevant. Yet the newspapers were filled with the matter of Maimie's disappearance at the time. Police were excavating her garden and scouring the rocks and caves of Caswell Bay, and the suspicions against George Shotton were rife in the press and in the community. It is absurd to imagine that Simons could not have understood the importance of his evidence at the time, or to believe that George Shotton would have been so incautiously stupid as to comment, "Oh God, I thought you were the police." It is worth remarking on Simons' evidence only in that it is a curious fact that in so many murders an elderly person comes forward decades after the event to claim someone confessed to them, or that they witnessed some indisputable proof of guilt. It is simply a curiosity of human nature. The jury considered the matter and gave its verdict that the bones were those of Maimie Stuart, that she had died between the 12th of November and the 6th of December 1919, and that she had been killed by George Shotton. It was a consolation of sorts that the body of Maimie Stuart had been recovered from the foot of a lead mine shaft on the coast of West Wales, that her end had been settled, and the man who was surely responsible for her murder was named, albeit posthumously. It gave an assurance, perhaps, to those of her family who remained, that she had not merely disappeared without trace, that she had not abandoned her friends and family. It did something else important also. It assigned the responsibility for her death to its proper quarter, to the man who had bigamously married her and lived with her under false pretences for 2 years, who had abused her and who had finally taken her life. It is unsatisfactory to human beings, to society, and particularly to those closest to the victim, to see a murderer get away with their crime. Though we know at some level that holding the perpetrator of such a crime to account does not resurrect the victim, that it hardly assuages the grief of those who feel the victim's loss, nevertheless there is a perfunctory satisfaction that a murderer has been brought to justice by the machinery of the society to which they belong. There are always other candidates in murder cases. In the case of a woman like Maimie Stuart, a flirtatious woman, known as a good-time girl, whose deceits were probably many, there will always be other lovers who may be shoehorned into the role of her killer. Maimie had an extensive retinue of former lovers on her CV. Whilst apparently married to George Shotton, she was involved with a Canadian paymaster, a farmer, and there were doubtless others. A journalist in the 1950s, Bernard O'Donnell, wrote of his being one of the last people to see Maimie alive in Cardiff when she visited a solicitor there, seeking a divorce from her husband. He said she had learned here that her husband was already married. The story is dubious at best, and none of this casts doubt on the guilt of George Shotton, or is sufficient to put a dent in the overwhelming circumstances which point to his being her killer. There is no real doubt that George Shotton killed Maimie Stuart, probably in a fit of jealous rage soon after the 12th of November 1919. Of course he will never be convicted of it, and there will always be some who prefer a less obvious solution to the murder, who may point to one of her elusive lovers as being the real murderer. But the evidence is compelling. The circumstances of her life with George Shotton, his bigamy, her relationship with him, the violent nature of their relationship, the mounting antagonism which such toxic relations naturally accrue, the timing of her disappearance, and the place in which she was found, not half a mile from the house at Caswell Bay, down a mine shaft which only a local resident would be sufficiently familiar with, all point to George Shotton's guilt. His claim to have seen her in Oxford Street in Swansea, some 3 miles away, on the 5th or 6th of December, clearly is exposed as a lie. There would be no reasonable explanation why, if this was so, she would have returned or have been returned by an unknown killer to the place where she was last known to be, if she had already left Shotton. It was a necessary lie, of course, to promote the idea that she was still alive on the 5th or 6th of December, and that she had left him and may have absconded with a lover, possibly to Canada. And Maimie was sufficiently flighty to give the police occasion to consider this initially. Maimie associated with many men. She was not a woman who would be considered by the yardstick of her time as being a moral one. She was clearly deceitful, not quite trusted by her friends. One demanded to see her marriage certificate because she thought that Maimie was capable of lying on such a matter. She was headstrong, independent. She had taken care of herself since she was 15. For his part, George was driven by a jealous passion which by turns shunned and rejected her, and yet could not quite relinquish her. He moved her to the house in Caswell Bay in November, partly because he wished to isolate her from the temptations of Trafalgar Terrace in Swansea, from her friends and from demobbed officers seeking transient affairs with a certain kind of woman. Caswell Bay fulfilled this need, but it didn't suit her. She was not a woman to be kept in a gilded cage. What happened some time after the 12th of November is unlikely to be discovered, but there must have been an argument, a violent one. Perhaps she finally decided to walk out on him, perhaps reiterating what she had said in one of her letters, that she would go to someone who was capable of looking after her. It would have been the final straw for Shotton, whose jealousy was now the dominant emotion governing his relationship with her. Whether she had plans to go to someone else or simply said so as one of the weapons she frequently used against him hardly matters. But it is a likely course along which the argument between them would run, because arguments between those who are in dying relationships follow a path which is well trodden, rehearsed many times over, involving the same repetition of the same devices in an ever-spiralling descent to the same outcome, either an abrupt severance of the relationship or a physical end to it. It was, of course, the latter outcome, inevitably, which had overtaken George. He had attacked her in the white fury of the moment, perhaps by suffocation, because apart from the sore marks there were no obvious signs of violence to her skeleton. Bruises to flesh leave no telltale, but strangulation, blunt force trauma, and stabbing almost certainly would. And of course, poisoning is a weapon of premeditation rather than one of passion, and this was a crime of passion. When he had killed Maimie, George had the natural relief that the matter had reached its inevitable conclusion, but also the shock and fear which accompanies such acts. His own well-being, his very survival, was now at stake. He had the advantage that no one appeared to be aware of Maimie's presence at the Caswell Bay house. There was no evidence that she had been there after the 12th of November. That gave him time, because her disappearance was not in imminent danger of discovery, which might force his hand precipitately, and force him into some rash miscalculation, like burying her in the garden. He had time to think of a suitable place for the body. Yet still there was a measure of urgency, because there was a body in the house whose discovery would almost certainly send him to the scaffold. He cannot remove the body without dismembering it, and this he does, using a saw. He's not a surgeon, and he does it inefficiently. The forensic pathologist commented on this at the inquest 40 years later. He has made hard work of the job, cutting through the upper arms and upper thighs to remove the forelimbs, removing the head, and also cutting the trunk in two, into a total of 6 or 7 parts. There are other abrasions for which the saw is responsible, which indicates to the forensic expert that Maimie has been sawn into parts while the flesh was still on the bones. It must have been a gruesome business, and was probably undertaken in the bathroom, as this is the commonest place in which such a messy job is usually undertaken. After he is done, Shotton wraps her in fabric, parts of her clothing and sacking, and he resolves that the best place to dispose of these parts is in one of the many potholes which litter the coast in West Wales. He is acquainted with these because he has been living in the area with his wife and son for some time now. He knows their remoteness, their inaccessibility. He must also know that there is a risk because of the proximity to the house. But he has little choice. The pressure on him to remove the body from the house is enormous. He cannot rest until he has removed it from there, disassociated it from its immediate and natural connection to himself. Yet at the same time, the further he travels with the body, the greater the risk. A consideration of these factors lead him to choose the air-hole of a mine shaft. He is a slightly built man. The shaft he chooses is 18 inches across. Not many men could negotiate an entry to such a confined space. It is a hazardous trip down 50 feet, not at all for the faint-hearted. But then nor is murder. He descended to the bottom of the mineshaft vent and discovered a tunnel at its foot leading to the main mining tunnels. It is here he chooses what he hopes will be Maimie Stuart's last resting place. He must have made at least 2 journeys down the shaft, one by way of reconnaissance to test its suitability, and another to deposit the body parts there. Of course, it is quite impossible that he should carry all his grisly packages down the shaft at the same time, and the more visits he makes to the shaft, the greater the risk that he may be seen, or that he may leave a visible trail for others to notice or even follow. It is likely, therefore, that on his second visit he dropped the packages down the shaft and then followed them, using only an electric flashlight as his guide. At the foot of the shaft he burrowed into the tunnel, clearing debris and burying the packages as best he could. Then he covered them with more debris, placed a large stone slab across the entrance, and blocked up the approach with further debris. It must have been a relief to him to dispose of the body, but he couldn't rest. He knew that one day someone would come knocking on his door. He delayed the inevitable outcome by sending a telegram from Newton Post Office on the 24th of December to her family. It was perfunctory, but would serve the purpose of effecting a delay to their inquiries. But every time a car drew up, or he heard the sound of footsteps in his drive, his heart must have skipped a beat. Skipped a beat as it had when he had first seen Maimie in the company of a friend on Sunderland Docks during the summer of 1917. The same, but different. His world would never be the same again. In some ways he would always be wedded to Maimie. He would never be free from her. As the years passed, she must have loomed in his waking moments and also in his dreams. He had discovered the burden that all murderers discover, their inability to free themselves of the human imagination, the imagination of the discovery of a corpse, of the dreaded headline alerting them to this, that of apprehension, of capture, the imagination that sometimes takes them 50 feet down a disused lead mine and wonders at the state of decomposition of a woman once loved. Of course there was a knock on George Shotton's door, but it was not for murder. No body had been found. It related to her disappearance. But as the press focused on the mystery, and the police interrogated him, and his wife and son left him, he must have sat in quiet terror of the secret he knew to lie in Caswell Bay. When he was finally arrested in Swansea Station, his first question was, "Have you found Maimie?" This was not an innocent deflection of guilt, as detectives suspected. It was rather the terror of a man who lived day and night with this fear, a fear that police, who were known to be conducting extensive searches of Caswell Bay, might have discovered her. They hadn't. They were arresting him for bigamy, and strangely, that must have been a huge relief. George Shotton emerged from Swansea Prison in the summer of 1922. He was 42 years old. His business as a marine surveyor was finished, and prison had taken its toll on him. His wife had divorced him. She remarried to a John C. Jones in 1927. His friends and colleagues shunned him. Shotton went to live with his parents at Tintern, where Wordsworth once found peace and inspiration sitting above the 12th century Cistercian abbey. There is a peacefulness and tranquillity at Tintern, which may have given Shotton succour too. But it was not to last. He seemed unable to settle or to find useful employment in the years that followed. After his father's death in 1929, his mother moved to Surrey and Shotton drifted. He was living in Balham, South London, for a time, and when his mother died in 1936, the husband of his sister Gladys, who was a bank manager in Fareham, Hampshire, was executor of her estate. It seems that she and 2 other sisters did rather better from the settlement than Shotton, and it led to rancour between the brother and sister. On the 23rd of May 1938, he travelled to Fareham and threatened her with a revolver. He was arrested some days later, and on July the 28th, 1938, at the Portsmouth Quarter Sessions, was sentenced to 12 months' imprisonment with hard labour. After his release in 1939, Shotton lived in Ledbury in Herefordshire for a time, and then in the Bristol area. He was in his late 60s now. He moved into a care home in Bristol in 1947, a place for elderly homeless people that had once been a workhouse, and in the spring of 1958 he had a stroke. He was taken to Southmead Hospital in Bristol, where he died on the 30th of April 1958, at the age of 77. Maimie Stuart was forgotten and her remains believed lost. But in 2019, her great-niece Susie Oldhall began a search for her great-aunt's remains. She found them locked in a cupboard in Cardiff Forensic Laboratory. In December 2019, the remains of Maimie Stuart, who had died believing she was Maimie Shotton, were finally buried in Bishop Wearmouth Cemetery in Sunderland, besides those of her parents, a century after she had died.